Welcome, everybody, to RISE Learning Machines seminars. I am Olof Mogre. I'm a researcher on foundational and applied machine learning at RISE. RISE is Sweden's public research institute, and this is our weekly seminar on AI and machine learning. This particular meeting is organized in collaboration with Climate Change AI Nordics, a new initiative connecting Nordic researchers working on applying AI to one of the most pressing issues for humanity at the moment: the adaptation to and the mitigation of climate change. The meeting will be recorded. Let us know if you want to be removed from this recording. And do check out the collection of great talks on our YouTube channel. Today, I have the pleasure to introduce Alp Kucukelbir, who is chief scientist at Faro Labs and adjunct professor at Columbia University. Faro Labs works on factory optimization software for industrial decarbonization. And Alp has his PhD from Yale University, where his research won a Best Thesis Award. He's part of the core team on entrepreneurship at Climate Change AI, which is, of course, the big foregoer for Climate Change AI Nordics. And the topic of today's talk is artificial intelligence for climate change mitigation. With this said, I will hand over the screen sharing and the word to you, Alp.
Sounds great. So, Olaf, just to confirm, we've got an hour session, but what's the format for interactivity? Should I be pausing for questions as I go?
It's actually entirely up to you. We usually pause for questions, but it's you'll have to go with what you like. Approximately 1 hour is the typical length. We don't have a fixed ending, but actually many people schedule for 1 hour, and then some people drop off after 1 hour because they have other meetings and so on.
Likewise on my side. Excellent.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to go through these slides. I'm going to go through reasonably quickly, but I'm going to pause at various occasions to see if you have questions, and hopefully that will make it a little bit more interactive. Thank you for the introduction, Olaf. That was great. So I want to give you a context a little bit about why I'm talking about this today. This is an applied talk, and the goal here is really to get all of you asking questions at the intersection of AI and climate change, not necessarily providing all of the answers. And the reason for this is I've had the great pleasure of working with the following set of wonderful authors, primarily David Sandlow, who led this roadmap project, along with my principal co-authors, Colin, Julio, and Mikhail, and including our distinguished co-author, Hosung Lee, who was the former chair of the IPCC, and a collective of almost 20 more authors to put together this roadmap, which you can find online. I'll provide a link at the end. It's a 330-page document that dives into a huge variety of topics at this intersection. And our objective is really to find the patterns in the different sectors where we can recommend academics, private companies, governments to really work effectively for solving problems in those individual sectors. So definitely check out the report, and everything that I'm going to be describing in this talk is described at a very high level. I did not even insert references. Everything, however, that I do discuss is heavily referenced inside the roadmap. So if you find something interesting, you will be able to find more detail in the roadmap. So the agenda and the loose structure of the report is an intro to AI and climate change mitigation. And then the bulk of the report is split into two. One is various sectors. Each one of these is a separate chapter, as well as a few chapters at the end that are around cross-cutting topics. And I'm leaving out many important chapters in this overview around policy recommendations and the risk of AI for misinformation and disinformation, very interesting topics. So here what I've done is I've selected the topics that I thought would be interesting for RISE. And what I show here in gray are actually what I very much realize I'm not going to be able to get to, even if I speed through this deck very quickly. So I am going to ambitiously try to get through everything that is not in gray. So we'll begin with a very high-level intro to AI and climate change mitigation. I will go through each of these sectors drawing some interesting parallels. We'll spend a little bit of time on these cross-cutting topics, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So before you fall asleep or log off, I just want to make sure that you have 3 things to take away from this call, from this presentation. And these are in our reports as well, and they go as following. So AI has the potential to make very significant contributions to climate change mitigation in the years ahead. And this can happen in 2 forms. One is incremental gains. Here we have an example as increasing the output of an existing solar farm or improving the energy efficiency of an existing building. These are examples of incremental gain. Transformational gains are also possible with AI, such as helping discover important new materials for really enabling clean energy technologies such as carbon capture. So I'll try to highlight those 2 differences as we go through various use cases. Now, there's a lot of conversation around the carbon footprint of AI itself. This is a very challenging topic to study, and we have done a very in-depth analysis of all of the other analyses and projections that have been released in the past 2 years about this topic. So the one thing that we can definitively say as of right now is that greenhouse gas emissions from AI is very small. However, what we can also say with high probability is that it is likely to rise in the future. How much it will rise is subject to a huge amount of uncertainty. If you're interested in this, again, we have a very nice chapter just on this topic. Now, we have a technical audience here, so I want to highlight a point that I think is truly essential to take away as machine learning and AI thought leaders, and that is trust is absolutely essential for AI to deliver the benefits that we are looking for. And for AI to be trustworthy and eventually to be trusted, various risks related to bias, privacy, misinformation, safety, cybersecurity, geographical bias, generalization, all of these things must be addressed. If there's, again, 3 things that you take away from this call, I hope these are the 3 messages. Without further ado, I'm going to keep the pace and just dive into AI. I'm not going to give a primer. I'm simply going to describe how we are going to talk about it in this conversation. So we separate the capabilities of modern AI into 4 categories. You can detect patterns from data. You can make predictions or forecasts about the future. You can take the result of a machine learning analysis and optimize a system using it. And finally, you can simulate new data or generate new data based off of a machine learning modeling exercise. The technical descriptions of those are below. What I will highlight here are the icons. The magnifying glass, this chart going up, these knobs turning, and this crystal bar I will insert throughout every single slide of this presentation to indicate to you what is the nature of the AI application when we talk about these different industries. Now, AI, beyond the 4 things it can do, has 2 properties that build into that notion of trust and managing risk. And those 2 things are causality, moving away from straightforward applications of machine learning in pure correlation fashion, just looking at patterns and seeing what is frequently seen with each other, towards physically meaningful causal relationships being represented in the machine learning model, is an essential component for many of the use cases I will describe. A second equally important area is uncertainty quantification. And you'll see that's why the language I have above is largely around probabilistic machine learning. Whether you come from a Bayesian background or you are adopting different approaches to uncertainty quantification, it does not matter. The main thing is giving a single point prediction without quantifying the uncertainty typically is a non-starter for AI in these applications. So I'm going to give now a very quick primer about climate change mitigation, then I'll do a brief pause before going into these different sectors. So the greenhouse gas effect is largely what we are talking about when we talk about climate change mitigation. So concentration of these gases, such as carbon dioxide, methane, in the atmosphere are higher than any time in human history. This is undoubtedly changing the Earth's climate. And here are a few statistics that really, make it clear that we're not talking about a mystery here. July 22 was the hottest day ever recorded. Last July was the warmest month ever recorded. Last year was the warmest year on record. The last decade is likely the warmest 10-year period on record. So I could show graphs. Doesn't really matter. This is basically a consensus view of the severity of the problem that we are handling. Now, human activities are the principal cause of the buildup of these gases in the atmosphere. So, given this, it is helpful to have a large reference of frame in terms of which sectors of human activity give rise to these emissions. So, about a third of global greenhouse gas emissions are caused by the generation of electricity and heat. This is largely through the burning of fossil fuels. However, a close second and third are manufacturing and agriculture and forestry. So these will be sectors that I will dive into. I think that all three of these are very interesting to provide examples from. Transportation and buildings are the fourth and the fifth that follow from there in these following percentages, and then everything else is smaller than the about 5 or 6% that buildings occupy. Now, if you're interested in um, gaining a better understanding of effectively how we got here, why this type of breakdown is possible, how we compute these breakdowns, and largely what are some of the system relationships between these different sectors, I recommend these three books. They have very different perspectives talking about the same topic. Bill Gates taking a more solution-oriented, innovation-oriented perspective. Vaclav Smil, who is a prolific historian and thinker in this space, very detailed analysis of exactly how all these systems interconnect, and David Wallace Wells, who's been writing about this for many, many years, providing really the impetus for us to the importance of why we need to be working on this problem right now. So before I dive into the sectors, you'll remember I'm going to go through the order of those most highest emitting sectors to least. Let me pause here to see if there are any questions before we dive further. And I'll open up the participant list if anyone wants to unmute to indicate they want to ask a question. Okay. Oh, yep, we've got one. Nope.
Yes. So I would like to ask, at the very beginning, you said that computing and AI would cause less than 1% of GHG. How do you calculate this number? Like where could someone look to be able to know more about that?
Yep. So chapter 15 of the report that I highlighted does an in-depth investigation of that. We look into proxies through electricity consumption at data centers. However, a very tricky component there is data centers do not only do AI computation. In fact, there's reason to believe that many trends are giving rise to the increasing demand of data center energy use, ranging from 5G telecommunication networks, increased video transmission over the internet, crypto, you name it. But we also look at upstream emissions in terms of the building of these data centers, the electronics, the chips that go into building the equipment that runs the computation. So we have a holistic analysis there, and then we have lots of the uncertainty bars for the predictions of the trends going forward are very wide. And I'll talk about that very briefly at the end of the call, end of the presentation. Any other questions before we dive in? Thank you for that question.
I can just chip in that I
Please.
put a link to the report in the chat.
Delightful. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. That I think is the old one. I'll give it a new one as well. So don't worry. Anyhow, you can find it. It's not difficult. The internet is functional. Okay, so let's dive into power system. So I'm going to give a brief background. The main challenge of the power system is that it must both grow globally and decarbonize at the same time. So AI is already being used in the power system in applications such as predicting solar efficiencies, optimizing the transmission and distribution of renewables, and facilitating so-called demand response programs to drive consumer shifts so that you demand energy when it is much more easy to produce. These are happening at, I would say, small scale. So there's many kind of barriers to entry, and we'll discuss that in a moment. But from a theoretical perspective, from a technical perspective, there are 4 different subsectors of power where AI can make a difference, and that's generation, distribution, the end use, and storage. So I'm going to now dive into each of these quickly. Again, my objective here is to really plant the seed in your mind that you see something in the slide and you're like, oh, I want to learn more about that. Again, we have a whole chapter on this that you can dive deeper. So power generation involves planning for the building of assets that generate electricity from some sort of source, and then operating those assets. So the planning component for building electricity generation assets is largely an optimization problem. There are people working to optimize the size and the location, for example, of solar projects using machine learning, taking into account, for example, complex terrain, wind properties, sun properties, so on and so forth. This is also true for windmills. Another area that I've seen activity in is accelerating geothermal deployment by using, again, machine learning, remote sensing to be able to improve the model of how much you can extract from a particular reservoir. Now, once you've built a particular solar, wind, geothermal, or other type of electricity generating asset, you want to operate it efficiently. And so for renewables, a big question is being able to predict what the output will be because it is variable. So weather models coupled with operating models become a huge opportunity for forecasting what is going to be the output from a wind or solar asset. Same thing in general. How do you now take these forecasts and really use them efficiently with each other to produce power on a grid? You can optimize the control, for example, the exact angle at which the windmills are looking at, and also do preventative maintenance. This is more of an optimization problem. Preventative maintenance is more of an unsupervised learning problem. Now, distribution is the problem that our renewable resources are frequently far away from our demand. So long distance transmission is a big problem to solve in this space. So transmission expansion planning is an activity that is highly regulated and very slow because it is a large scale optimization problem that must be solved for every proposal in the order that it will get built. So the most reliable flow of electricity through a transmission network, it needs to be computed through very complicated simulations that machine learning can help reduce the cost of. This is already showing a great amount of promise in speeding up this application. Another is dynamic line rating. So the transmission lines that we have are almost always operated with very large buffers. Big margins. We're not operating them anywhere close to their capacity. That's because if you overload a transmission network, that is very dangerous. So being able to adapt to when you are generating power cheaply, when there is demand, and how you can route that power in a very efficient way can really increase capacity by enormous amounts. Of 30 plus increase in percentage here would be a game-changing amount in terms of how you can route power. Now, how we use power is equally important. So appliances, which is a very common household consumer of energy, but increasingly electric vehicles. really can be optimized to reduce demand in a way that is coherent with how we are producing it. So again, we have the ability to predict demand at increasing spatio-temporal resolution. So you really need to be able to get as much resolution in time and space to make these predictions useful for operators, but also really help people cluster together. Right? There's no real technology out there that helps you understand whether you as a neighborhood or you as a city, if all of you did something for 1 hour and you collectively aligned for that 1 hour, would have a significant benefit. This type of distributed optimization is a very interesting problem. Now, with the increase of residential, solar, and electric vehicles, battery storage, we are moving towards a world of what we call virtual power plants, where there is energy storage and energy generation and transmission capability distributed over the entire network. So this is a scenario where optimization and simulating various scenarios, including peer-to-peer transmission, is an interesting application of AI. Now, with power storage, energy that is produced is typically mismatched in terms of its demand. So this storage capability is becoming essential as we think about what this transition looks like. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip this particular slide, but again, you'll have access to the slides and the report. Every sector I'm going to end on a slide that looks like this, with the barriers and the risks side by side. Poor data quality is a huge issue in the power sector. There's limited standardization in countries like the United States, a little bit better in the European Union. That's very important. A common trend that you'll see is lack of AI talent in these specific sectors is a huge opportunity. So technical audiences like you, I love to send the message. If you're interested in solving problems in these specific sectors, spend some time to learn the actual language, the jargon, how they think about framing their particular pain points, because the more people we have working at that intersection, the greater our success is going to be. On the risk side, I would maybe highlight cybersecurity as a very interesting risk. As we think about the deployment of AI into these operational settings, AI is software. And just like any software deployment, there's going to be a large consideration around what are the cybersecurity concerns there. This is something that is a significant risk, especially when it comes to the power system. So let me walk through manufacturing, and then I'll take a pause about any questions about power sector and manufacturing. So manufacturing is the second largest segment of emissions that are caused by humans. The breakdown by sectors is about 1/3 of manufacturing emissions come from steel, another 20% come from cement, about 13% come from chemicals, depending on how you do your accounting, and the remaining 33% are things like aluminium, glass, paper, and other manufacturing. Now, manufacturing is very difficult to solve for two reasons. Manufacturing processes require sustained levels of high heat. And when I talk about heat, I'm talking about thousands of degrees. Generating these high amounts of heat is typically an activity that is directly coupled with the burning of fossil fuels. In addition to that, some processes like cement manufacturing, the chemistry itself of taking limestone and eventually producing it to make cement directly emits CO2 as part of the chemical reaction. So there are these fundamental challenges within the manufacturing sector. However, there are still significant applications of AI to provide both incremental and transformational change. So AI can help the direct process of making things. I'm going to give a very specific example about that, but also supply chain optimization and adopting dematerialization strategies, swapping out high carbon footprint materials with low carbon footprint materials in buildings and things like that, as well as the impact of maintaining equipment. I'm going to spend most of my time on this particular topic, and I'll blitz through these two. So, AI has both incremental and transformational opportunities in the actual manufacturing process. So if we look at this picture on the right, the top is how we currently produce most of our goods. We take virgin feedstock. These are raw materials that are typically produced by the mining sector, and maybe little bits of some recycled materials, and we put them into a manufacturing plant. And because the manufacturing plant is not designed to really adapt to the volatility of the quality of recycled materials, these manufacturing plants are doing a lot of so-called over-design, which means that they are blending raw materials with recycled materials. They are producing with a lot of buffers. And all of this is, of course, producing reliable products that we all depend on in our lives, the steel and cement and concrete and chemicals that power our entire economy, but produces a lot of waste. Now, the IPCC has repeatedly over the last two assessment reports indicated that material circularity is an essential component of the green transition. So we have to move towards making plentiful amounts of all of these materials, steel, chemicals, building construction materials, using recycled feedstock. Now, this is a manufacturer's nightmare because the quality and the properties of recycled material is very difficult to control. As a result, if you were to give that to a manufacturing plant, you would not get reliable products unless you bring in a transformational technology like AI that can actually optimize your production end to end, adapting to the variability and the volatility here. So that's the first few examples I mentioned here. This is a common trend that I see personally across the steel, chemical sector, and this is happening today. There are various other interesting applications of AI. I will maybe mention enabling expertise retention. This is a very kind of non-trivial one. The workforces in many developed nations that work at manufacturing plants are retiring, and they are not able to recruit at the same speed as their expertise is retiring. So there is a challenge to take someone who has 4 years of experience at a manufacturing plant and have her work as efficiently as someone who has spent 30 years at that manufacturing plant. Well, there is the fingerprints of the experts on the manufacturing plant in their historical data. So how do you equip the new people working at these plants to leverage historical data, find patterns that really enable to do their job efficiently is a very interesting application of AI. Now, decarbonizing supply chains, I mentioned you can focus on with AI. You can optimize manufacturing schedules. I'm just going to talk about the headers here. You can minimize logistics overheads. Both of these are prediction and optimization opportunities, and you can evaluate and adopt dematerialization strategies. This is typically a simulation. And you can maintain industrial equipment. Equipment is designed to operate continuously, but in practice, there's a lot of shutdowns, startups, and adapting to market conditions. So machine learning and AI can help with monitoring, planning for maintenance, and managing alerts at very large scales. Now, the major barrier in manufacturing is a lack of incentives. It's very difficult to convince manufacturers to adopt a solution just because it reduces their carbon footprint. Increasingly, we have more incentives around the world. The carbon border adjustment mechanism in Europe is one example of that. But right now, it's best to align machine learning and AI applications to cost reduction because the incentives are already baked in there, and almost every application of AI that I have seen in the manufacturing sector typically is associated with an efficiency gain, and that naturally reduces their costs. Now, an important risk here, I would say, is that maintaining AI systems is something that is essential because factory conditions are constantly evolving. It's not fair to just imagine that if a factory operated in one way for the last 6 months, it's going to continue operating in the same way for the next 6 months. Machines are deteriorating over time. Processes of how they operate the plant are changing over time. So this needs to be reflected in how the analyses are conducted. Okay, so that's the first two sectors at hopefully fast enough speed. Let me pause here to see if anyone has any questions about either manufacturing or the power system.
Okay. I was thinking
Oh.
about you mentioned the swapping the high carbon materials or improving the processes of sort of developing them. Where do you have the best promise here?
In terms of new material innovation or optimizing existing commodities like steel and cement and
I was thinking of the existing ones as steel and cement.
yeah. So many of the opportunities are incremental. So you can do things like minimizing energy consumption by saying, hey, your data indicates that you've been using too much steam and it's just being wasted. You know, you can improve, for example, the yield of a chemical reaction, where in the lab you might put in 1 unit and 1 unit of something and expect to get 2 units of your final product, but at industrial scale that typically does not hold. It's difficult to scale things up. Now those are much more on the incremental side, and when I say that, I'm probably talking about somewhere like 5 to 10, maybe 15% benefit, but you can get it right now, right? There's no hardware changes, nothing of that sort. The more transformational opportunities come from switching how you produce, which is largely through the adoption of recycled feedstock or recycled fuel stock. This is another example where you can take lower quality fuels and different sources of energy and start introducing those and retrofitting your existing equipment to use those. Those are both good opportunities for AI-based optimization.
Thank you.
Of course. All right, so let's march on. We can always come back. I'm going to talk about food. I'm going to talk about transportation. I'm going to talk about buildings. I'm going to talk about them even quicker than power and manufacturing, given that they are decreasing in the size of their carbon footprint. So bear with me here. Now, the food system is very complex. Two things I want to highlight is that it's not only about CO2, especially when it comes to food. 50% of emissions from food come from methane, and 50% of global methane emissions come from the food sector, and 75% of global nitrous oxide emissions come from the food sector. These greenhouse gases have different lifespans than carbon, but they have different impacts in terms of the global climate. This is just a picture that shows how complicated the food system is, but let's dive into a few examples here. So one that is very promising is using machine learning AI for remote sensing to drive data-based decisions. This is largely based off of analyzing satellite, drone, and ground-based imagery. When I teach this topic to machine learning students at Columbia, frequently this is the first application they think of because images are so pervasive in terms of how machine learning and AI researchers have conducted research over the last maybe 10, 15 years. So it's natural to think about where are the opportunities if we use images. Object recognition, land use identification, temporal monitoring are all aspects where there are opportunities for unsupervised and supervised learning methods to provide value. Now, a very interesting direction I'll highlight, just to pique your curiosity, is agricultural simulations. Now, there are models that have been developed by first principle methods for years that project climate-based crop growth. So given what the conditions are going to be, what do we think is going to be the output from a particular plot of land? However, machine learning models can also predict both global and regional crop yields. And it can do so integrating many, many different data sources, such as not just things that you measure about the soil or the immediate ambient conditions, but satellite vegetation data and other drivers. So what you're seeing is, instead of a world where we used to take classical sources of data and a first principle based crop model and feed these into a machine learning model to get a prediction of what is happening, increasingly the data is being fed into both a crop model and directly into machine learning, with different types of data sources going into machine learning then goes into the crop model, and the machine learning model then supports the crop model in making its yield predictions. So this plugs a gap that's not captured by current crop models, but the crop models are already in use right now. So it's easier to help the adoption of these types of results when they are presented in terms of existing methodologies that the people who are using this data are used to. So very interesting area. Crop breeding is the task of developing new crops that have higher yield and stress tolerance against different changing climates. This is largely a genomics type analysis where machine learning has been fundamental in expanding the scale of what we can analyze, and this has been increasingly applied in the food sector as well. Now, the barriers and risks are similar but slightly different. A big one that I will highlight is that there's limited transferability of agricultural data, largely because of geographical differences. It requires an enormous amount of expertise to be able to confidently say that data that you have gathered in Sweden can be utilized to even analyze and optimize something in Spain. So this is a gap that many machine learning researchers might say, hey, I don't know what to do, but because it's such an important barrier, it requires that intersection with the domain experts to figure out what is required to bridge that geographical bias. Now, the other aspect here is really, I would say, a risk is access to tech, right? So the communities that are going to most benefit from having access to this type of higher technology to improve their yields are also most likely the communities that will not have the surrounding resources, whether it's data gathering, whether it's a technological infrastructure, an education infrastructure, to be able to adopt these technologies. So it's important for us, as those of us working on these technologies, to think about how can we bridge that gap? How can we enable communities to leapfrog and access this technology in a way that does not require them to spend the 10, 20, 30 years that we spent to be able to get to this point? It's an important risk to keep in mind. Now, transportation is where most of my students, typically their eyes start glowing, mainly because when you think about power, when you think about manufacturing, when you think about food, I would argue that most people don't think about those things at all. It's just an invisible aspect of their lives. You plug in, you get electricity, there's heat, there's gas at the gas stations, there's material, buildings are built, okay, and I have food. But everyone thinks about transportation. It's a very kind of personal thing. You think about how you're going to get from one place to another. It's an important segment of the global footprint, mainly when you combine aviation and road transport. So in our report, we separate these two things because they have unique opportunities for AI and unique barriers. But in this presentation, I've combined them so we can look at some of the parallels of how AI can help reduce the carbon footprint of both. So because it's two chapters combined, I'm just going to list some of the ideas here. And again, what's in gray, I'm not going to be able to talk about today in any detail. So from road transportation, there is opportunity for developing, improving, and deploying electric vehicles, as well as adopting alternative fuels in things like long distance road transportation. There is also a huge interest in how to use AI to adopt intelligence transportation systems. So these are cities and roads and lights and signals and everything really connecting to one another in a way that reduces the carbon footprint of operating a transportation system, as well as encouraging people to shift towards public transportation. If you're interested, go to the report. However, I will talk about the deployment of autonomous vehicles, which is another area that is driven by machine learning and AI technology improvements. On the aviation side, there's three directions. One is improving aircraft design to make them more efficient. Another is optimizing air operations. You might have read about the contrails study that was put out, I think it was earlier this year or late last year, which was very interesting. I'll talk about this in more detail, but also advancing towards sustainable aviation fuel, since it seems like electrifying aviation is quite a bit further away. So what is the opportunities for producing fuel in a sustainable way to continue powering the aviation sector? So I'm going to combine topics together here. The structure is a little bit different. It's a little bit more high level. So for electric vehicles, machine learning has a huge opportunity for material discovery. So improving and speeding up the design of battery systems is already something that people are using Bayesian optimization, active learning to achieve. Same thing for improving electric motor designs. Once you have batteries, improving their efficiency and lifespan is frequently a task that relies on predictions of exactly how well a battery is functioning, what is its health, and how much charge does it have. And those all go into interesting problems around controlling the charging process. Now, batteries are consuming a huge amount of new materials. There's lots of conversation about where those materials come from, and there's an increasing interest in using recycled materials for battery production. Similar to the conversation in steel, much more technologically kind of advanced because the space is very open. Another interesting area is vehicle to grid charging. This kind of taps into the power system a little bit, but as we deploy increasing amounts of electric vehicles, that increases the distribution of considerable storage capabilities. And so thinking about how vehicles can both draw energy from the grid, but also give back to the grid. Now, autonomous vehicles are largely, again, the advancements here are driven by machine learning techniques, so reinforcement learning methods and other algorithms to control the vehicles, as well as using the data and the ability to control the vehicles to optimize routes and minimize traffic and things like that, are all part of that sector. However, we highlight an interesting paradox. Autonomous vehicles may actually increase carbon dioxide emissions in the long run as well, because it may overshadow alternatives such as public transport, where it becomes very attractive to just use autonomous vehicles, and it also might increase demand. Again, because it becomes very easy and attractive and you don't need to drive yourself and you have a very good user experience. So that's an interesting kind of dynamic there. Now let's talk about fuels. I mentioned a sustainable aviation fuel, but I also mentioned briefly alternative road fuels. So here there is an entire direction around how can we basically plug the short-term gap in terms of creating biofuels, in terms of creating synthetic fuels, and maybe even switching to other sources of natural gas. These are not going to disrupt the whole gasoline pipeline, that we rely on, but are applications where AI can have a potential impact, and these might actually be very useful strategies in the very near term. Now, in sustainable aviation fuel, the challenge is much more difficult because we basically need a drop-in replacement for kerosene. It's very difficult to retrofit planes. They're heavily regulated. Cars are also regulated, not nearly as heavily as planes. And so AI is being used to generate candidate methods for accelerating the synthesis of these drop-in replacements. The issue here is that there's too many things that we could possibly test, and doing so in the physical real world is very expensive. So it's useful to use AI to basically sift through those potential synthesis methods and only test the ones that have a higher probability of providing success. Of course, you can then adapt the engine design itself with minor tweaks to basically accept a broader range of sustainable aviation fuels. And in each of these applications, you have prediction, optimization, and simulation providing value. Now, in improving aircraft design and optimizing air operations, it's going to be a very similar story, right? You can incrementally make engine design better. You can improve aerodynamics. The common trend here is that you replace expensive computation using first principle methods like computational fluid dynamics with faster and cheaper AI techniques that are approximate. However, if the approximation is good enough, the speed up can help you develop your process much faster. So that's a common trend that we see. As for airport operations, adapting to wind, weather much better is an essential component, but also operating the airplanes themselves is a very exciting application, such as how you optimize where the airplanes climb, how quickly and how slowly, but also minimizing contrails. So I want to show a picture of these contrails. Contrails are these artificial clouds that are produced by airplanes under specific conditions. This is a snapshot of the Gulf of Mexico in the United States. And in red, you have three major airports kind of around here. And you can see in this particular visualization how much is created by the basically hubs of these airports and planes flying to these places. Now, these clouds can have a very significant impact in terms of how they trap heat and greenhouse gases in various different conditions. So optimizing for this is a very interesting application in aviation. So, barriers here are mostly regulatory, I would say, especially in aviation. Safety is an enormous component for good reason. As a result, the regulatory frameworks are very stringent, so it takes time for solutions to go through. On the risk side, there's again a risk of uneven socioeconomic benefit. If this technology is only available to those who develop it, and we don't think about how to make them available to economies that are catching up, it's that runs the risk of widening, increasing the gap. So let me go through buildings, and then I will completely pause. So building scope 1 emissions are around, 6, 7, 8%, depending on how you count it. AI can be used really in a few ways here to reduce the emissions of the built environment. You can change how you design buildings and the materials that you use. You can adapt how you build them directly, the process of construction, and how you demolish them, recovering recycled materials that are important for the rest of the economy. And you can think about how you operate a building, the heating, the cooling, the lighting, all those types of things. Another interesting direction is that buildings are increasingly becoming energy producers themselves, whether it's solar panels on the roofs or other methods. It's interesting to think about whether that power can be used even off-site as energy producers beyond the building itself, and thinking about how buildings connect to towns, which are interconnected systems, to cities, which are even larger interconnected systems, all have applications for AI. Now, in the design and material space, the objective is to reduce the amount of carbon that goes into the materials and eventually how that affects how you operate them. So concrete is the mixture of cement and a bunch of aggregate materials, sands and stones and other things to bind together. So much of the concrete production happens on site. It's mixed on-site and it's done in very simple and primitive ways. Machine learning has the opportunity to optimize that during the mixing. Figuring out where you want to build buildings, especially large projects, great application of AI. Another one that I'm always excited about is people are using machine learning AI in the design process. So at the CAD phase, they're using it to optimize, okay, where should I put the windows? What should the wall to window ratio be so that I have passive cooling, passive airflow? All of these types of things are very exciting developments for AI. Now, how we build and demolish, same situation. There's a very big lack of visibility in terms of where are the carbon sources when you are building and when you're demolishing a particular building. So there's opportunity to integrate new data sources, such as video data from drones, but also using accelerometer and gyroscope data from heavy equipment machinery to use as a proxy to say how active is this equipment, how hard is it working, and what is the carbon footprint. Just even quantifying the problem is essential, creating visibility into then providing solutions to solve it. Now, when we think about prefab, which is a very interesting direction, this has an opportunity of reducing the carbon footprint because you consolidate all of the manufacturing in one place and you very ideally, efficiently can ship it to where it needs to be quickly put together, reducing a huge amount of carbon footprint in terms of the actual production on site. Optimizing the schedule and making sure that you can adapt to supply chain flexibility is a big challenge for this particular sector. For operations, it's exactly what you think. Optimizing HVAC systems, heating, ventilation, other mechanical systems, elevators, optimizing appliances, refrigerators, lighting. Are there people in this room? Is it a big office building? Why are the lights on over the weekend? Very basic stuff can be automated, made very simple, so that it's just automatic. We're not wasting that energy anymore. Now, the barriers here, I would say, are geography is important, of course, but I would say low digitization. The number of buildings that I see in developed economies that have ancient technology, nothing is connected, nothing is measured, is mind-boggling. And there's a very slow rate of digitization in that sector. Now, The risk, I would say here, is maybe I'll highlight the distraction risk. This is a good one. If the solution is as simple as making sure that people turn the lights off and don't keep the AC on over the weekend, is AI necessary to achieve that outcome? No, right? But thinking about, again, how do we achieve this impact at scale versus how do we just adopt common sense solutions that don't require machine learning, doesn't require the fancy stuff? Important consideration to have. Okay, so I'm going to switch to cross-cutting topics, but let me pause here to see if anyone has any questions on those three sectors. Okay, so we have very little time left here, and I do want to make sure we leave some time for questions. I'm going to go through this very quickly. So AI has a huge opportunity to help us monitor emissions at scale. And this largely is a problem of data integration, segmentation of images, classification, but the results can be absolutely instrumental because it can be done at scale with satellite data at increasing, again, spatial and temporal resolutions. Trading off the spatial and temporal is a constant battle with any kind of data source coming from space. Coverage is another challenge. However, this problem needs lots of people working on it because policymakers, regulators, carbon market monitors are all increasingly relying on a common and singular source of truth so that we can very clearly indicate where the emissions are coming from, when they were emitted, where they were emitted. All of these are very important. So this is an example of methane, which is much more challenging to detect in image data than other greenhouse gases. And the super emitters that have been identified automatically globally at scale using an AI algorithm. So it's important to, again, think about the scale of the problem here. It's quite challenging. Now, I've alluded to materials innovation a few times, but this is really important because there are aspects of the technological transition that rely on the assumption that we are going to get better materials, whether it's in photovoltaics for solar, semiconductors in general, magnets, catalysts for chemical reactions, polymers, alloys and composites for lighter wind turbines, lighter buildings. Now, material innovation from a scientific community perspective has been largely experimental. For example, LEDs that use this chemistry were invented in the 1960s. They were all red. I don't know if anyone is old enough here to remember, but like when I was growing up, all LEDs were red, And all scientists knew that if we could create LEDs with a different chemistry, we could get them in different colors, ideally white, to be able to replace the incandescent and fluorescent lights that we are currently using. It took 30 years to discover the chemical production process, which is a two-flow MOCVD process, to actually produce these materials. So AI can help simulate predicting the properties of novel materials and to accelerate this process. It can also be used to mine the hundreds, if not thousands, of papers that are being written by different communities, chemical engineering communities, material science communities, manufacturing communities, to figure out what is working at scale and really helping to accelerate the synthesis of these methods. Frequently, there is a very high value candidate material, but even thinking about how do we produce this in the real world can be an exercise that takes an enormous amount of time. AI has a huge opportunity for helping accelerate that. So these materials are huge, very important. For example, here is a direct air capture site. I believe it's in Iceland. And the materials that are used to suck carbon from the air are constantly being innovated, and they are being innovated using AI to reduce the time to improving the efficiency of these processes. It's going to be part of the equation no matter what. Now, there was a question earlier on about the carbon footprint of AI itself. I want to talk a little bit about it in this slide. I don't know if the person who asked the question is still online. I think he might have dropped off, but anyhow, I will go through this. So data center power demand is about 1.5% of global electricity. It's higher in the developed world, a bit lower in the developing world. But by 2030, we're expecting a 5 to 15% annual growth. Almost every single think tank, every single bank, every single analyst is modeling something in that range. Now, not all of this is going to come from AI. And there's a similar amount of demand coming from electric vehicles and cooling and things like that. The other issue is that as the electricity demand of power center goes up, the carbon footprint does not necessarily need to go up. It can, and that's a big challenge. And so there's now a big kind of fight for sourcing green electrons to power this demand. Now, this is a typo. I apologize. 2023 at this point, AI emissions 1% is an upper bound for sure. It's probably much less than 1% at the moment. However, in 2030, what will happen? Will hardware efficiencies really scale, reducing the energy demand of AI? Will software efficiencies do so? What about the rebound effect? If it gets a lot cheaper to use AI, will we use more of it, therefore erasing those efficiency gains? And again, where is the electricity coming from? Are we building gas turbines to power these data centers? If so, it doesn't really matter how efficient it gets, right? So the high growth rate of large language model demand is highly likely to continue. So that's what we're really tracking these days. Okay, so repeating, in case you fell asleep, 3 things to take away. AI has a huge opportunity, incremental and transformational, depends on the application. The greenhouse gas emissions of AI, very low, certainly will increase. We don't know by how much. And trust in AI, thinking about bias, risk, uncertainty, making sure that it is capturing causal relationships are all essential for the adoption of AI in these methods. So here's a link there's many links where the report lives. This is one that I'm happy to share, but you can also search for this online if you have any topic that you're interested in diving deeper into. The report is there, but also feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to discuss any of these topics with any of you.
Thank you, Alp. Do we have some quick question before Alp needs to leave in 3 minutes?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes, please.
First of all, thank you for an excellent presentation. It was really great to hear this vast overview of all the great things that can be done. So I was just wondering, I mean, some of the, do you have some core assumptions within this report about sort of the future trends of society in general? Because you mentioned, for example, an expectation that power demand has or will increase and so on, which I believe is like the assumption of many. But there are also other lines of thought, for example, about abandoning the ideals of growth and so on. So I was just wondering, have you reflected on other avenues than just kind of continued growth as at large, if you get my question?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think it's a very interesting conversation to have those, and I think having them in very specific sectors is where it is more fruitful. Having a conversation around degrowth at a more holistic kind of global sense, I have not found to be a very productive avenue for practical adoption of reducing carbon footprints. The argument in the developed world is largely that there's no incentive really to do so. The argument in the developing world is, well, all of you had this 50-year, 100-year advantage. We want it as well. And if growth is what it's need for us to become a rich nation, a modern nation, why would we kind of give that up? So I think the effective place where that argument holds is in things like dematerialization, right? And thinking about how do we bring both incentives and regulatory frameworks to reduce the amount of stuff that we're using or the amount of energy that we're using, but we are not imposing a lower less abundant lifestyle or society. So it's more about, are there ways of bringing that degrowth conversation into one that is very focused towards achieving the same outcome, but the narrative still remains one of abundance and one of being able to lift yourself and improve your living standards. That's where I've seen the most fruitful conversations.
Thank you a lot for the input here.
It's a great question.
Do you have some sort of rule of thumb or something for, you've been into this sort of using high tech to optimize low tech solutions, which is probably a good way to go for many things. Sort of how should we as practitioners, as machine learning practitioners, prioritize our work? What should we sort of, yeah.
Great question. So we need more people at the intersection. So across all of our chapters, we describe a lack of talent as a fundamental barrier, a lack of data and a lack of talent. These are the two common barriers across all sectors. There aren't enough machine learning practitioners who understand a domain enough to be able to have those conversations. There's not enough domain experts, people who work in these fields, who know enough about AI and machine learning to understand how to integrate these things. So we need translators, and that needs to come from both sides. So what I would deeply encourage is that the scale of the problem is huge. So you can't solve everything. So what you're interested in, learn as much and talk to as many people as possible to gain the understanding of that sector. It's not going to be complete, but that's fine. And that really enables meaningful impact that you can then tangibly track of your work, because you are working with the people and you're working with the institutions and entities in those sectors.
Right. Thank you.
Yes. Frederick.
Yes, thanks, Alp. Great presentation again. And, so speaking of domain knowledge, the importance of domain knowledge, and would you have any reflection on the stage of maturity in each of these sectors to drive development, given the need for engagement and ownership, let's say, for AI opportunities in each of these industries?
It's a fantastic question. Power is one of the most challenging, largely because a mixture of culture, where power generators, utilities consider themselves not necessarily businesses with various incentive structures, but rather just a public service. And so the mindset is very much just like, do what we need to do. People rely on us. Like, what do you mean innovation? That's not our job. Other people innovate. We're the reliable people who get you the electrons, right? That mindset is very challenging. The other thing is regulated. Yeah, every sector has regulation. Every geography has its own unique regulation. So the opportunities are huge. The barriers are very high. Manufacturing is more innovation driven, and as there is increasing pressure on manufacturers in terms of costs, that typically is a good incentive that leads to the adoption of this. The same is true for food and agriculture, I would say, at the more developed level. So multinational agricultural, companies, producers at scale, they're able to think about adopting this technology and thinking about innovation. However, agriculture and forestry is very distributed. So there is a huge challenge of thinking about how does this technology become really distributed, the same way that a phone, a technology has become distributed and everyone can use it without requiring some centralized coordination. Buildings, as I mentioned, there's a data and digitization gap, but it's very easy to solve. So the leaders in those spaces are adopting these types of technologies at scale, and that's exciting, but the industry in general is lacking. Transportation is a decentralization question as well, right? It's one thing to go to Boeing or Airbus and say, hey, let's do this thing. You're going to see the effect in 15, 20 years. That's what the cycles look like in aviation. But if you go and say, hey, I'm going to change the behavior of how people drive cars, okay, you can do that tomorrow, but it's extremely distributed.
Really, yeah, really useful. Thanks a lot. To be continued, I suppose.
Yeah. So I also need to hop, but I'm happy to continue the conversation. Olaf, if you'd like to share my email, if not, just please search me online, my name. And if any of you have any conversations you would like to continue, I'd be delighted to take it offline.
Amazing. Thank you so much for this inspiring talk. I will just add to those who stay to hear my last 10 seconds that next week we have Alireza Teri de Cordy from Lund University talking about estimation of water quality parameters using remote sensing data and machine learning models. Welcome back next week.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.